I'm Tony Katzer, the CEO of the IAB Tech Lab. We've teamed up with Marketecture to celebrate the Tech Lab's 10th anniversary by highlighting some of its most impactful work and the dedicated members who make it all possible. Please join us in celebrating our 10th anniversary at Tech Lab Summit on June 11th and 12th in New York City, where we will be discussing the future of these standards and more topics, including artificial intelligence, the future of privacy, connected television, cross-environment measurement, and so much more. We hope you enjoy this series and look forward to the next 10 years.
Welcome to Marketecture, where you can get smart fast with in-depth interviews of leading technology vendors. This is one in a series of interviews conducted in partnership with the IAB Tech Lab to celebrate that organization's 10-year anniversary. In these interviews, we learn about the history and impact of some of the Tech Lab's most impactful work. And today, I am here with Neal Richter, who's currently the Director of Science and Engineering at the Amazon DSP, and he's here to talk about Ads.txt, Sellers.json, and related activities, which he played a really big part in. Neal, thanks for being here.
Great to be here, Ari. Good to talk to you.
So, in simple terms, what are these standards?
They are technology standards really for identification of authorized parties in a transaction. The legacy in OpenRTV has been the buyer is pretty easy to define. We had seats. We had advertiser IDs, creative IDs. A domain was very clearly identified. Every company had a list of seat IDs that defined who the buyer was, basically who the budget owner was. But we didn't have a great way, other than trust, to be sure when a buyer was bidding on a piece of inventory if it was what it says it was, right? So this standard is really about seller authentication.
Right. So when you say that it was what it says it was, we're talking about that the seller had the right to sell it and was representing the right piece of inventory.
Correct. Absolutely. The thing to remember in the early days, and still in some respects today, everything in OpenRTV is a string that is not signed, right? So there's a lot of trust in the intermediaries that is placed to not manipulate that content. And so this was a case where you started with a set of ideas and then narrowed down on one.
So let's go through the before period. What was happening that was bad?
Well, that's a great question. So at the time, I was CTO and chief scientist at Rubicon Project from roughly 2009 to fall of 2016. And one of our issues is we were a premium exchange. You guys were buying from us at the time. And it was the hard thing. We had great relationships with our publishers and we're broadcasting inventory for bids via OpenRTV. And you could trace that inventory back to a publisher. But as a buyer, couldn't prove it. And so then header bidding created this explosion of other sellers who all sort of broadcast very similar bid requests with very similar information. And as a buyer, how do you know that which of these chains are authentic and inauthentic? And so the problem was, if you were a buyer, how do you know that this ad is going to land on the site that you intended? So the big problem was, and this was an eye-opening moment, not only were there some ad server dark tests where the ad server was shut down and then you measure all the stuff that flowed at the point when the ad server was shut, but then there was also just basic tests where we would share reports with a publisher and say, hey, here's what's available on the open market for your website. How many of these do you think are yours, right? And so it was like dedupe the header bidding replication and then say what's left.
Right.
What's left is the inauthentic inventory. And so that was the problem. How do you differentiate?
Right. As a bidder, as a DSP or an advertiser, if you wanted to buy, let's say, a domain like nypost.com, you might see it coming 50 different ways from different sellers and have the pricing also have enormous variation. And it turns out maybe some portion of that, maybe half of it is real that the New York Post wants. Some of it is outright fraud. It's just not the New York Post. And some of it might be real, but not in the way the New York Post intended, right? That was a big problem also.
Correct. There was various grades of inauthenticity. So I remember there was a seminal moment for me where I had left the Rubicon Project and became an independent consultant for a while. And we're working on a couple of projects. And this was one of those projects. And I talked to an old client and kind of showed her this report. And I said, all right, here's all of the inventory that's coming from your website, very well-known website. And I sent it to her via email. 5 minutes later, I get a call saying, Neal, I don't have anywhere this many avails for this inventory. What is this? Like, okay, this is why we need to solve this problem.
Right. Okay, so tell us about the genesis of this project. Who came up with it, how it developed into what it developed into?
That's a great question. So it started with a lot of the work that we did at Rubicon and at other exchanges, all trying to figure out how to squelch this inauthenticity problem. And then once I had left and started working on this problem independently, partnered up with a few different companies, including Google, who was pretty good at this in terms of recognizing, but there was no declared kind of standard. And we came up with 3 core ideas within this small working group. And I was very involved with the Tech Lab at the time. And so we kind of created an unofficial working group around this. And you can see all the participants in the first rev, which we released in June. We started with 3 ideas. And those ideas were effectively Ads.txt, which was about declaring the right to a publisher saying, here are my sellers, myself and others. The other one was mimicking what Google was doing with their network sellers list in some ways. And then the third one was something we called Ads.cert, which was the idea of actually getting to a point where we could start thinking about signing cryptographically these OpenRTB requests. So 3 different ideas. Yeah. We picked the simple one.
Let's go through the simple one first, because I think probably almost everyone who's listening to this has a pretty good idea about Ads.txt. It's asking the publisher how they sell their inventory, because they should know, right?
Yes. So the simple analogy that Per and I used, Per Bjork from Google, and wrote this with George Levitt and a bunch of other folks in this working group. Per and I used to talk about, all right, so here's the 2 problems. So Rolexes, right? If you've got a Rolex and you're buying it from an authorized agent, an authorized seller of Rolex, you have a greater assurance of that being not a fake watch. But if you buy it from anywhere that doesn't have that, you're taking a risk of it being some kind of subgrade fake or a super fake, that's not authentic. And you can kind of see this now on major auction platforms on the internet. They have this authenticity guarantee. And so these types of high value products go through an authenticator that will then reject it if it's not real. So we would use that example for essentially inauthentic inventory that's not what it claims to be. And then the other one was blending. And so the example we would use is Kona coffee. If you go to a grocery store and you buy Kona coffee and it's $10, $15, it's probably not Kona coffee, because 100% Kona coffee is like $35 to $50 a pound. And interestingly, within the last year, I just sent a link to Per noting that there had been a lawsuit by the producers of Kona coffee to all the other folks claiming to use that trademark and essentially blending who knows what kind of coffee in was like 5% Kona.
Right.
So
okay, so your Ads.txt is only from the Ads.txt region of California.
Correct. Then what we were also mimicking was some of the old standards from email. Because back in the day, email servers had the same problem. When you had an email server that was relaying email for other servers, they had the same inauthenticity problem. And you could have a bad actor in the middle that was doing a relay insert a lot of misrepresented emails. And so we also took some inspiration from a bunch of those standards. And a lot of them had to do with encryption, had to do with this declared sources. I forget the name of the spec that was with email, but we were sort of saying, okay, these things work for email. Let's apply them to ads.
Okay. So what does Ads.txt do, simply?
Ads.txt is really simple. As a publisher on my domain, I'm going to declare the set of exchanges and seller IDs that I have authorized to sell. And additionally, I'm going to declare the ones that I operate, that I'm operating myself, and the ones that I've authorized others to operate. So the first pass is that the ones that I as a seller operate are called direct. And so then what you had was this designation of, here's the domain of the exchange, which uniquely identifies the domain of the exchange. It's the operational domain of the exchange, like a company that owns a couple of exchanges and has a banner name, but then they're actually operating their technology at a different domain. You declare the operational domain. And then there's the number. And that number or string identifier is the same one that's supposed to go in the publisher ID of OpenRTB. And then the designation is direct versus reseller. And then at the time, the tag group was out there trying to certify intermediaries as being compliant. And so we had this fourth column of that tag ID. And so then it was a way for the publisher to absolutely declare these are authorized.
Right.
And then which implicitly means any other avenues through any other exchange or other seller that is not in this list is not authorized by me, the publisher.
And you just put a file on your root domain, ads.txt. It's just a file. Should be easy. Shouldn't get a lot of flack from the engineering team. And boom, you're ready to do business. Got it. Okay. So let's move on. So sellers.json, what is it in simple terms?
So sellers.json is the thing that was mimicking the seller network identifiers list that Google has had, the ad server, for years. So it's very simple. This is a file that an exchange, a seller system like an exchange, that's going to be broadcasting bid requests. This is a file they put on their website in JSON because we needed a lot more structure. It wasn't meant for humans to code by hand. It was meant to be a machine interpretable specification. And it's a list of the entities that are doing the selling and therefore going to get paid on that specific exchange. So basically you can trace from a line in the Ads.txt file to that identifier at that domain /sellers.json should now resolve to an entity in that block. And then you can see some information about who that company is, what they're authorized to do by that exchange.
So sellers.json is exclusively for the indirect channel. Is that right?
No, because there was this notion of directness that we put in that
directness.
Spec. And then
What does directness mean?
Directness. I'd have to get the spec out and we could read it together and reason about it. One of the things we did in sellers.json is we cleaned up this notion of direct versus reseller, and we defined things as either direct or an intermediary. Let's just say that no one really liked the reseller tag. Everyone wanted to be direct, and so there was a lot of gamesmanship being played to get all the intermediaries. None of the intermediaries wanted to be listed as resellers.
No.
But we just had to make a decision at that point in time and get a file out and get a spec out. But then what happens, and you can kind of still see it today, is that oftentimes everyone is listed twice. And so that we tried to clean that up with sellers.json. And there was a whole big working group there. And, Judd at the trade desk was very influential, as well as a number of other folks in defining that specification.
So let's talk about an example, because I think sellers.json is harder for people to get their heads around. One example I've heard a lot is about like outstream video vendors. So you have an outstream video vendor on the bottom right corner of your page, and they're running an auction on their own and just rev sharing to the publisher. So the publisher doesn't have a seat necessarily on the exchange. It's the vendor who does. So that's a direct relationship, but with a sellers.json entry that explains that. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So the idea is that any seller that's listed in sellers.json, you should expect to be getting bid requests from, right? It's a declared entity by the exchange that identifies who's doing the selling and who's going to get paid.
Right. So the exchanges are creating this file, and it helps the DSP understand what all their seats are and what they mean.
Yes. Yes, in some sense, if we'd been a little more prescient, we would have called those sell-side seats and buy-side seats, right? Like, actually, I had a lot of admiration for how AppNexus structured this back in the day. They had members, and you had buy-side permissions and sell-side permissions. And so buy-side seats, sell-side seats, kind of natural. And in a lot of ways, we were trying to mimic such a structure, but we wanted to keep the word separate seats and sellers. So there's almost an implicit buyer in parentheses in front of the word seat.
Right. So a buyer grabs an entry from seller.json and says, this is, let's say, the outstream video vendor. Okay, I know that's who they are. And now they're sending me all kinds of domains in our bid requests, and they're multiple domains because they represent many sites or an ad network effectively.
Yes, they may represent
so then
many.
I could now double check, and I could go to the ads.txt and say, wait a second, they're selling on behalf of this publisher and they're not on the ads.txt. That's a problem.
Correct. And then we were very careful when we released sellers.json. So with Ads.txt, we released the crawler. I wrote the first one. It's not a great crawler. It was a piece of Python and SQLite that would just do a good enough start as a demonstration. But then with sellers.json, we created some implementation guidance and some pseudocode that would allow the buyer to do that resolution step, which is what you're saying, which is like, okay, I've got a bid request in hand. I have these keys in the bid request. I know what exchange is coming from. And now I can check, is this publisher ID, on the sellers.json, is it an authorized entity? And now, is it authorized to sell this domain or app that's coming from that publisher and is declared in the publisher object? So it's cross-checking and validation.
Makes sense. Okay, then now the last one, sellers.cert. Is that what it's called?
The next one is S-chain, where it kind of flows into S-chain.
Okay.
S-chain was chain of custody, right?
Right.
Really, the OpenRTB request is the final hop in a bunch of stuff that happens ahead, right? So you resolve the final hop. So Ads.txt and sellers.json were about misrepresentation, but we were all very clear that this wouldn't help you with the blending problem, i.e. the 5% Kona mixed with, regular commodity coffee is now, sold for a premium, labeled as premium. So we had that problem. So we could solve misrepresentation, but it was hard to solve blending without that chain of custody. Right? So S-chain was really about an object with a sequence of nodes. And again, lots of influential people. Huge shout out to Judd for helping drive this. Judd, Bill, others, where it was like, okay, as a buyer, I want to know that I can look at this list of nodes and process them going backwards, right? So you start at the last one. That's describing the current bid request. And then as you walk back, you can actually validate it all the way to the bottom by cross-checking everything. And what should happen is the last node should be, in a sense, the final hop in the chain of intermediaries to get you to the publisher.
And the implementation is that the publisher puts a certificate of some kind on their website?
Well, mostly it's on the buyers to do all the validation because we created this implementation guide, which essentially is really about resolving the S-chain all the way back to the pub using all of this data. I mean, it created this cottage industry for folks like Jounce and others to sell data sets, which are quite good and quite effective. They do a wonderful job at really helping you process all these chains. And by the way, the Tech Lab sells for very cheaply a process data set that's been joined and validated that a buyer or a seller that's acting as an intermediary can use and process and validate along the way so that everyone's using the same data.
Good plug for the Tech Lab. I apologize. I obviously am not that familiar with this third protocol. So let's talk about adoption. Ads.txt got adopted incredibly rapidly, if I remember correctly.
Yes. We released it in June 2017. And at that point, I joined Rakuten and was on the buy side working on a bunch of their different remarketing engines. And so became a kind of validator of this spec. But it took a lot of adoption because it basically let publishers have something to do to get control of the inventory that was claiming to be from them. And it created a sort of a transparency incentive for buyers to know what they're buying. Right. And so it put a lot of pressure from both ends, from the publishers and the sellers, for the intermediaries in the middle to kind of flush out and reduce the monetization capability of the kind of inauthentic stuff.
It wasn't exactly bumpless, though. I saw a lot of bad Ads.txt documents with all kinds of weird things in them.
Well, like anything else, right? One of my older jokes is OpenRTB is a way to trade bytes for money, right? It's one of the handful of APIs that let you do that. The other is AdSense. That lets you literally exchange bytes for checks that you'll get at the end of the month. And so there's quite a bit of incentive for bad actors to try and game the system in some way and create messy Ads.txt files. And you can see it. There's companies that have very neat and clean Ads.txt files that control everything. And then there's unfortunately a lot of publishers that have Ads.txt files that are very long. And then so our generic guidance has always been, as a publisher, anyone who's asking you for an entry, treat it like you're giving that someone a key to your front door.
Right.
And that you need to know that you can get a check or trace money from every entry in that list. And if you can't, you should be wary of putting someone on that list or allowing them to have a copy of your house key.
Absolutely. Yeah, so publishers move pretty rapidly. On the buy side, a little more work, but I think it was adopted probably within 6 months. And one interesting thing was that buy-side DSPs had to make choices about what to do in different scenarios, because you could have a clean match or you could have a site that just hadn't gotten to having Ads.txt yet, or you could have a no match. And it was sort of up to the buy-side whether they fully blocked or gave the option to their customers. Did you see any of that?
Yes. We had the whole concept of non-participating, right? So publishers who weren't participating. And so we had to release a truth table. So it was like participating publishers, here's what you should do. Non-participating publishers, you were back to kind of the old way of judgment and trust of your intermediaries. But then what happened was, as you probably know, the buy side started amping up and basically saying, okay, unless all this stuff is declared in this way, then we're going to sort of reduce bid frequency or bid prices on those chains. And in some sense, it all ended up creating supply path optimization.
What about sellers.json, the adoption?
Well, sellers.json was pretty quick to adopt because it didn't require millions of websites and apps to post a file. It was basically the intermediaries that were doing the selling. And they already had this data in their databases. This is how they kept track of who was going to get checks and who was selling what impressions. Yeah. So literally, they were just externalizing their list of sell-side customers.
But what about on the buy side?
Now, on the buy side adoption of sellers.json. Using it. My recollection is that was pretty quick because the thing that you lacked as a buyer is any sense of who that seller was. Just because the seller was posted in the Ads.txt file, that there was no guarantee whether that seller is someone that you would want to do business with as a buyer.
Right.
Especially if you thought that they were blending. Because in some sense, the risk for as a buyer is if you have this well-known publisher that adds a seller to their list, now that seller has entry into the market and has permission to use that name in the marketplace.
Yep.
And they could be sourcing traffic from bot networks that are manufacturing traffic and then just sort of staple that name to it, and it looks clean. So one way to figure that out is to use the sellers.json information to try and triangulate who seems to have a lot of rights for inventory, and can I check that that's true?
Yeah. Sellers.json is a great tool for evaluating partners and figuring out who's who and what's going on.
Well, in some sense, it was sort of patterned off of some of the financial exchange patterns where you've got to have a Dun & Bradstreet number, right? There's some entity resolution service.
Yeah. Every entrepreneur shivers when they hear a DUNS number, a vendor asks for that is the worst. So how have these standards evolved over time? There's a push to make them work in-app and CTV, a lot of real challenges to doing that because there are no websites.
Yeah, that's a good point. It was probably in the range from 2018 to 2019 that we really started working on app. And the problem with app was that you had to have help from the App Store because you didn't have the internet domain names, right? Mm-hmm. So our first assumption was every app probably had a website, which was mostly true. There was get into some nuance there. So what we needed the app stores to do, and there was a controlled number of them, Apple, Google Play, Amazon, in terms of just the mobile stuff or tablets, they just needed to post a very simple link that from an app would point to that app's website, and then you would drop into Ads.txt, which is essentially auxiliary information to the main TXT, so you could make that connection. Because when you're buying mobile, as you know, you get a bundle ID.
Right.
It's not a domain name. You get a bundle ID. So now you have to resolve that bundle ID and create a linkage between the bundle and the domain. So then you can do your resolution.
Were you asking
we needed
them,
some help.
Yeah. Were you asking them to put the URL in their app store or in their app? In the app store.
In their app store.
Yeah.
In the app store. So it needed to be a special tag in the header that was essentially a declared relationship. And the app stores had some incentive to do this because, their apps really wanted this assistance so that crawlers could validate the bundle IDs. Because the bundle IDs, there's no DNS entry for the bundle IDs. No. They're just identifiers. They're namespaced within the app store. So there needed to be that linkage.
Did the app stores comply?
They did.
Even Apple. Did Apple return your phone call?
Forward. I had some quiet conversations, and then what generally happens is that suddenly the links appear.
Sure. Do us a solid, Apple. Thank you.
Yeah. So do us a solid.
Any thoughts on adoption of in-app or CTV for this?
Well, CTV is the good one. By this time I had moved to SpotX, which was a great crew. And we wanted to do the same thing in CTV for a couple of different reasons. There's another digit in the CPMs, right? So it doesn't take long to sort of misrepresent yourself into a lot of money when there's two digits to the left of the decimal point instead of 1 or 0 in front. So it's pretty profitable way to, with a low volume, get a lot of cash if you're a bad guy. So we needed to do that. And of course, the TV marketplace is a little more fractured. So we needed to work with all the kind of quote TV app stores, which are generally all the brand names at the bottom of your television, your videos, your Samsungs, of course, Amazon, Google. Or you had to work with anybody who was selling sticks that you plug into the HDMI port because the app store was that device versus the, whatever's in your screen. But it was very similar. So it was the same concept. There was a link that bridged you to the website. when you could do your authentication. Now, there was a thought that maybe deal IDs would keep you safe. The problem is deal ID is just a string too. There's no signature that authenticates the string. So you need to create these same structures.
Yeah.
And you still need to know that the bid request and the intermediaries involved are who you think they are.
Right. That makes sense. So overall, very successful. Any thoughts on where this is going moving forward? Is it done, or have there been any further proposals or changes?
One of the ones we didn't work on, going back to the 3 ideas, was basically, what became Ads.txt declared sellers. And then we had Ads.cert, which was the thought that we would sort of sign things.
Yeah, Ads.cert, that's what I was thinking of. That's why I was so confused a little earlier in this conversation.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then there was actually authenticated devices, right? So there's, going back to, spring of 2017, we're still not done with 2 of the 3. So Ads.cert is a simple mechanism. It's way too early, realistically. It's just a way to declare, here's my public key to the world. It's a cryptographic key that's in that file. It's my public key. If I'm running a website and I post that, anything that's signed with my private key can then be authenticated with the public key. But it requires a level of cryptographic sophistication, and then we have to figure out what we're going to sign. So you worked on it. There were a couple of different folks that are crypto geeks. And this is very different than Bitcoin, by the way, right? That are just about creating, where can we use digital signatures? That didn't really go anywhere. And now Ads.cert is used in a few different ways. But that third one was the device attestation, and that's really easy to think about. That's the idea that the manufacturer or issuer of the device, could, in theory, vouch for the device to essentially sign the device ID, right? So then as a buyer, if I can take the device ID and check the signature, I know it's just not a random string of jumble of device of identifiers, jumble of text, but it's actually authenticatable as being an authentic device.
Right. That would protect against headless bots and things like that, right?
Absolutely. Headless bots, fake devices streaming out of a data center or a cloud provider.
Didn't Roku privately do something along those lines? There was an announcement a year or so ago from them that they'd authenticated those Roku traffic.
They did. A lot of the efforts kind of probably didn't use cryptography, and I think in the way that a best practice would do. But there was some early efforts. I still think this is not finished, and I think it's critically important for CTV, especially because there's 2 digits on the left side of the decimal point.
Yeah, it would seem like any device manufacturer would have an incentive to do this.
Now, there's a privacy problem with it, though.
Oh, yeah.
Because by signing the device ID, now you're authenticating that this device
always a privacy problem.
Is authentic. And so, well, what do you do, right, to a privacy person? The worry would be this becomes like a authenticated, certified, trackable ID, right? So what do we do in this situation? Like, how do we simultaneously authenticate devices so that as a buyer, you can trust that this is going to go to the thing that I want it to without opening a hole? Yep.
Interesting. Well, last question. If Ads.txt was an animal, what animal would it be?
Well, I want to say it would be an eagle, basically just watching, right? Just flying above, watching the movement, looking for things that could be, maybe that's not the best.
Maybe every once in a while it sees a weasel and dives down and kills it.
Yeah. There's no animal that is like an accountant. They're like checking every step, right?
I think
so if there
might
was
be
an animal that was an accountant, it would be that animal.
I'm going to ask ChatGPT which animal is most like an accountant, and I bet there'll be a good answer. All right, Neal Richter, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ari. Really great to be here.
Thanks for listening. New interviews are added every week at Marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.